The city breathed history in every crack and faded mural. Along its worn streets, where the past and present collided in a silent testimony of both suffering and hope, an elderly man walked slowly. His steps were measured, carrying the weight of decades lived under a system that had often been cruel and unyielding. Each footfall on the cracked pavement echoed the voices of those who had once fought for justice, while the quiet determination in his eyes spoke of a resilience that refused to be broken. He moved with a dignity that set him apart from the hurried masses. The old man's face, etched with deep lines in quiet sorrow, told a story of endurance, a story of silent battles waged against prejudice. As he strolled past battered storefronts and time-worn buildings, memories of past struggles flickered in his mind. "I have seen too much injustice to ever let my spirit falter," he murmured softly, more to himself than to anyone else. A kind neighbor passing by with a gentle smile greeted him warmly. "Good morning, Mr. Harris. Your strength shines through even on the darkest days." Though Mr. Harris only offered a slight nod, the compliment resonated deeply, a reminder that his quiet defiance had not gone unnoticed. In that simple exchange, the shared pain and hope of the community pulsed softly beneath the surface. Yet, on this day, the normal rhythm of the morning was shattered by a harsh intrusion. Abruptly, rough voices cut through the air, and the peaceful cadence of the street was replaced by a discord of authority. Without warning, a group of officers in uniform descended upon him. Their faces were set in rigid lines, their eyes cold and unyielding. "You're coming with us," one of them commanded, his tone devoid of any warmth. In an instant, Mr. Harris's quiet walk turned into a moment of public humiliation. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong," he pleaded, his voice trembling with both fear and disbelief. His words were swallowed by the cacophony of orders and the sneers that followed him. The brutal grip of the officers stripped him not only of his freedom but of the dignity he had spent a lifetime preserving. As he was roughly led away, the onlookers stood frozen, neighbors, passers-by, even those who had once hidden their anger behind quiet resignation. They all watched in silent horror as another act of injustice unfolded before their eyes. From across the street, an older woman's whispered words broke the heavy silence. "This isn't right. They've taken too much from us already." Her friend, standing close by, replied with a determined tone, "One day, we'll rise above this hate." Today, I see the spark of change in his eyes. In that small exchange, the seeds of hope were sown, a hope that despite the relentless force of prejudice, the human spirit could still find a way to stand tall. Inside the police car, the cold metal seemed to close in around Mr. Harris. The bright, harsh lights inside the vehicle did little to chase away the deep shadows of his past. In that cramped space, his mind wandered back to times when he had witnessed his friends and family suffer under the same weight of systemic injustice. The voices of those long-gone voices that had marched, protested, and yet never lost their dignity whispered in his heart. "Courage is born in the face of adversity," he recalled his mother saying, a phrase that now lit a small, stubborn flame within him. He sat there, quietly processing the gravity of his situation. The stark reality of his arrest was a painful reminder of the long history of discrimination that had scarred his community. But beneath the sorrow, something else began to stir, a fierce determination that had been smoldering all these years. "I will not let them silence me," he thought firmly. The injustice of this moment was not an end, but the beginning of a fight that extended far beyond his own life. Outside, the murmurs of the crowd grew into a gentle chorus of resolve. People who had once been merely silent observers now exchanged glances filled with both grief and a renewed sense of purpose. An older man leaned toward a young friend and said, "My father always said that true strength is born when we stand up for what is right. Look at him now, he's showing us that courage never fades." The young man's eyes blazed with hope as he replied, "Yes, his bravery reminds us that change is possible, even if it starts with just one act." Back inside the car, Mr. Harris closed his eyes for a moment. The memory of all those who had suffered, of every quiet battle fought in the dark, surged through him. It was a heavy, painful burden, but also a source of immense strength. In that tight, suffocating space, a plan began to form in his mind. A single act, a solitary call, might be all that was needed to challenge the forces that had oppressed him for so long. "I have lived through too many storms," he whispered to himself, his voice steady despite the tremor of fear. "Today I will let my voice be heard." His thoughts grew clearer, each one a stepping stone toward reclaiming his dignity. The oppressive weight of the moment was slowly giving way to the possibility of change. Every memory of past injustice, every silent protest that had marked his long journey was coalescing into a single, resolute decision. Even as the police car continued its relentless journey through the city, Mr. Harris felt an inner strength building, a strength that was born from decades of enduring, surviving, and quietly fighting back. Outside the vehicle, the city seemed to pause. The whispers of onlookers, once scattered and fearful, now formed a united undercurrent of defiance. There was an unspoken understanding among them, a realization that this arrest was not just an attack on one man, but on the very soul of their community. The air was heavy with both sorrow and the promise of justice, and in that charged atmosphere, hope began to spark. Within that moment of confinement, Mr. Harris resolved that his next action would not be one of submission, but of bold defiance. "This is not the end," he murmured under his breath. "It is the beginning of a new fight, a fight for all of us who have been silenced." His words, quiet yet resolute, were carried by the hum of the engine and echoed in the hearts of those who listened from afar. The memory of his mother's gentle advice, the echo of his own steadfast resolve, and the determined faces of his community all blended into one powerful conviction. That single thought of one decisive phone call emerged as a beacon in the darkness. It was an act that would not only challenge the oppressive system, but would also ignite the spirit of resistance in every heart it touched. As the journey continued, the old man's eyes, once filled with quiet sorrow, now shone with the embers of hope. The stark injustice of the moment had awakened within him a force that had been long dormant, a force that would soon rise to defy the hate and reclaim his dignity. With every beat of his heart, the promise of change grew stronger, and the idea of that one brave call became a rallying cry for a community desperate for justice. In the silence of that police car, as the wheels carried him toward an uncertain fate, Mr. Harris knew that his life was about to take a new turn. He was ready to transform his personal pain into a powerful act of defiance, a spark that could light the way for all those who had been beaten down by systemic cruelty. And so, with a resolve that transcended fear, he prepared himself for the moment when his quiet determination would burst forth into a call that echoed through time, challenging the very foundations of injustice. The city, scarred yet hopeful, held its breath as an old man readied himself to make a choice that could change everything. In that pivotal moment, the promise of a brighter tomorrow shimmered in the heart of the one who had borne the weight of countless years. His was a journey of quiet defiance, of enduring hope, and now it was poised to begin a new chapter, one where his voice would finally shatter the silence of oppression. The day had already turned gray when the harsh sound of raised voices cut through the quiet rhythm of the street. An elderly man, known by many in the community for his quiet dignity, found himself abruptly surrounded by men whose eyes were as cold as the metal of their badges. With measured, deliberate steps, the officers closed in. One barked, "You're coming with us," his tone leaving no room for protest. The old man's heart pounded fiercely as he felt the rough hand seize his arms. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of disbelief and fear. His words fell on deaf ears, drowned by the harsh commands and the echo of footsteps on the cracked pavement. As the officers dragged him away, every bruise and every moment of humiliation etched itself into the collective memory of the onlookers. Inside the old man's mind, the present collided with memories of a past steeped in struggle and sorrow. He remembered his mother's soft voice warning him about a world that often showed no mercy. He recalled the times when his friends had been treated as less than human, their voices silenced by injustice. Each memory was a reminder of battles fought long before this moment, a history that both haunted and hardened him. A neighbor, trembling with a mix of anger and despair, whispered to another, "This isn't just his fight, it's all of ours." The words, heavy with unspoken pain, floated in the air. Even as the crowd watched with silent horror, a quiet resolve began to kindle within him. In that grim moment of confinement, the old man's thoughts churned. The weight of his past, once a burden, now served as fuel for a fierce determination. He recalled the countless days when hope had been nothing more than a distant dream. And yet, the spark of courage had always flickered in the darkness. Within the claustrophobic confines of the police car, the steady hum of the engine merged with the chaotic pulse of his memories. "I have survived worse," he murmured to himself, voice low but determined. His eyes, though filled with pain, shimmered with an inner fire, a reminder that no amount of force could break the spirit of someone who had weathered decades of prejudice. Each scar, each faded wrinkle, was a testament to a life marked by silent resilience. A soft voice from the back of the car broke through his reverie. "Mr. Harris, why are you so calm?" It was a young officer, his tone surprisingly gentle for one who belonged to a system steeped in authority. The old man's lips twitched in a faint smile as he replied, "Calm is all I have left when the storm of injustice rages." The response, though quiet, resonated with a truth that cut deeper than any shouted command. Outside, the murmurs among the crowd grew louder. Neighbors exchanged worried glances, their hearts heavy with the shared burden of witnessing another act of systemic cruelty. In a small cluster near a battered storefront, a community elder spoke softly to a younger man. "This moment will not define us. Our history, our struggle, it has always been our strength." The younger man nodded, eyes bright with a mixture of sorrow and a burgeoning hope, as if the old man's enduring spirit was a call to arms. Back in the confined space of the police vehicle, Mr. Harris's thoughts wandered to the quiet acts of defiance that had punctuated his long, arduous journey. He remembered the small rebellions, silent protests, a steady refusal to yield to humiliation that had allowed him to cling to his dignity in the face of relentless oppression. "I will not be defined by this moment," he whispered, his voice gaining strength with each word. It was not a cry of despair, but a declaration of defiance, a promise that his life, with all its trials, would not be silenced by the cruelty of those in power. As the journey continued, his mind began to weigh the possibility of one final act, a phone call that might shatter the chains of systemic injustice. The idea took root slowly, yet with an intensity that belied his years. One call, he thought, just one call to make them listen to our pain. In that quiet resolve, he found not only a path to reclaim his own dignity, but also a beacon of hope for all who had suffered silently. A memory surfaced of a conversation long past, a conversation with his brother who had once said, "Our voices are our weapons. Even in silence, our truth speaks." Those words echoed in the back of his mind now, urging him to transform his personal suffering into a collective cry for justice. He realized that the injustice he faced was not his alone. It was the mirror reflecting the struggles of an entire community, worn down by years of systemic abuse. The anger and fear he felt were shared by many, and this realization only deepened his resolve. In a soft yet steady tone, he began to speak aloud, as if to convince both himself and the indifferent walls of the car, "This is not the end. Every injustice has its turning point. Today I choose to be that turning point." His words were not shouted. They were gentle, but each syllable carried the weight of a lifetime of suppressed courage. Outside, a young activist in the crowd listened intently, whispering to a friend. His voice, even now, reminds us that our fight is far from over. The heavy air inside the car was filled with more than just the scent of fear. It was laden with the promise of change. Mr. Harris's internal dialogue was a tapestry of memories and aspirations, interwoven with the stark reality of the present. He recalled the faces of those who had come before him, faces marked by suffering. Yes, but also by an unyielding spirit that refused to be subdued. Their silent struggles had paved the way for the possibility of this very moment. The young officer, still curious, asked again, "Sir, what will you do now?" The question, simple yet profound, carried the weight of his own uncertainties. With a calm that belied the storm raging within, Mr. Harris replied, "I will speak. I will make a call that echoes the voices of every soul that has been silenced. It is time that those who govern hear the truth of our pain." There was a pause, as if the words themselves were a fragile promise, a promise of resistance, of transformation. Even as the car moved along the road, the world outside seemed to hold its breath. The community's murmurs grew into a determined silence, a collective anticipation that something monumental was about to unfold. Every step, every whispered word of encouragement, was a part of the unspoken pact among the people to stand against the tide of prejudice and injustice. Within the confines of that metal box, Mr. Harris's mind was a battleground. The harsh reality of the present collided with the soft echoes of a long-forgotten past. Yet, in the midst of his internal conflict, one truth shone clear: his struggle was not isolated. It was part of a continuum, a chain of defiance stretching back through generations. And now, with his resolve hardening like steel, he embraced the idea that a single act of courage could ignite the spark of change. He leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment to gather his thoughts. In that stillness, the faces of those he had lost, and those who still fought, came vividly into focus. Their eyes, full of both pain and hope, urged him onward. "For every tear shed in silence, there must be a voice raised in defiance," he murmured. The words were not just a mantra, they were a call to arms for every soul burdened by the weight of systemic injustice. The decision crystallized in his heart. The oppressive gravity of his circumstances began to lift as he prepared himself mentally for the next step. He was no longer just a victim of an unjust system, he was a vessel carrying the hopes of a community yearning for change. The idea of that single transformative phone call now shone like a beacon in the darkness, offering a way to challenge the deep-seated prejudices that had plagued him for so long. With a final, determined exhale, he opened his eyes, a steely glimmer replacing the quiet sorrow. "Today I speak for all of us," he said softly, almost to himself. The resolve in his voice carried a promise that his silent suffering would soon give way to an act of defiant courage, a defiant act that could resonate far beyond the confines of that moving vehicle. As the engine continued its relentless journey, the old man's mind settled on the plan that would change everything. The thought of making that one decisive phone call filled him with both trepidation and an unyielding determination. It was a small act, perhaps, in the grand scheme of an entrenched system of oppression, but it was an act that carried the weight of every voice that had been muted by discrimination. It was an act that, he believed, would mark the beginning of a long overdue reckoning. In that moment, as the car rolled on and the city watched in hushed anticipation, Mr. Harris's resolve burned brighter than ever. His journey toward reclaiming his dignity, his truth, and his power was poised to take a bold step forward. And with every beat of his weary yet determined heart, he prepared to transform the pain of the past into a rallying cry for justice, a cry that would not be silenced. The quiet determination of one man, standing against the tide of systemic injustice, was about to send ripples through the fabric of community. As the wheels carried him toward an uncertain destination, his thoughts were no longer consumed by fear. Instead, they were filled with the promise of change, a promise that, at last, his voice would break the silence and light the way for a brighter tomorrow. The air inside the car felt thick with both dread and a quiet, rising resolve. He sat motionless, the soft glow of the dashboard illuminating trembling hands. His heart pounded in a slow, deliberate rhythm, a reminder of every harsh moment endured, every insult and injustice that had marked his long life. In that silence, he could almost hear the echo of his mother's gentle words from years past. "Even when the world is dark, let your inner light shine." Taking a steadying breath, he reached for his phone with hands that still quivered. "I must do this," he whispered, not loud enough for anyone to hear but resolute enough to cut through his inner fear. The weight of a lifetime of prejudice and pain pressed upon him as he stared at the blinking screen. Each number he dialed resonated like a heartbeat, each digit a connection to a hope that had been buried too long. "Hello?" came a measured voice on the other end, a voice that broke the silence and stirred something deep within him. "This is Benjamin Harris," he said, his tone soft yet carrying the strength of his years. I'm calling on behalf of every person who has been silenced by injustice. Today I refuse to let our pain go unheard." Outside, the world paused as if in disbelief. In the crowd that had gathered, neighbors, quiet bystanders, those who had suffered in silence, there was a collective intake of breath. His words, spoken with an unyielding clarity, rippled through the air like a long-awaited storm. For a moment, he hesitated, his finger lingering over the phone as he recalled a lifetime of struggle. Memories cascaded into his mind, of rallies fought with peaceful determination, of whispered prayers in the dark, of promises made in the quiet of night. He remembered his father's steadfast voice, "Stand up when you're down. Our courage is our legacy." With each recollection, the resolve within him grew stronger. "I have survived the worst," he murmured to himself, "and now I will rise again." The operator's response was deliberate, thoughtful. "Mr. Harris, your message is clear. We will ensure your voice is heard." His words were calm, and yet they carried the weight of acknowledgement, a promise that the system could no longer ignore the truth of their suffering. A spark of relief and determination lit within Benjamin. "Thank you," he said softly, the words a blend of gratitude and a renewed call for justice. Outside the confines of the car, even the distant murmurs of the onlookers seemed to transform into a chorus of hope and resolve. They had witnessed not just an act of defiance, but the birth of something greater, a collective yearning for change. As the line went silent, the man sat back, letting the gravity of his action sink in. In that small, significant moment, he had bridged the gap between his personal suffering and the broader call for social justice. "This is not just for me," he declared in a quiet tone. A statement meant for his own ears as much as for the unseen forces of change. "It is for every voice that has been muffled by hate, every tear that has fallen in the dark." His thoughts wandered briefly to the faces of those he had loved and lost, friends, family, and strangers whose lives had been marked by the same harsh reality. Their memories melded with his own, and with each recollection, his spirit gathered strength. "We have all carried this burden for too long," he thought. "Today we rise together." In that decisive instant, the phone call became more than just an act. It transformed into a beacon of defiance against the long shadow of systemic injustice. It was as if the very act of speaking had broken a dam of suppressed emotions, allowing a flood of hope to surge through him, and, by extension, his community. The operator's measured words had done more than promise action. They had affirmed his right to speak, to demand that the deep scars of prejudice be healed. The engine's hum and the soft vibrations of the car no longer felt oppressive. Instead, they served as a steady reminder of the forward motion of life, a life that, despite its trials, moved toward a horizon of change. In that quiet determination, Benjamin knew his journey was far from over, but he had taken the first step. A single, courageous phone call had set in motion a series of events that would ripple outward, challenging the entrenched structures of hate and paving the way for a future built on dignity and justice. With his heart now steady and his mind clear, he whispered, "I speak for all of us. Today, our silence is broken, and our hope is louder than ever." His words, soft yet resolute, floated in the air, carrying the promise of a new chapter, a chapter where courage outshone cruelty and unity triumphed over division. As the car continued its journey, Benjamin's mind was calm, his spirit emboldened. His resolve had transformed his pain into a clarion call for change. In that pivotal moment, he had not only reclaimed his own dignity, but had also ignited a flame of resistance in the hearts of those who had long suffered. The path ahead was uncertain, but the power of his voice and the strength of his conviction would light the way toward a brighter, more just tomorrow. The aftermath of that fateful call rippled through the neighborhood like a sudden summer storm. In the hours that followed, word spread quickly, carried by hushed conversations on porches and whispered hope in dimly lit hallways. Neighbors who had long felt the weight of silent oppression now found themselves buoyed by the unmistakable power of one man's defiant act. On a quiet street corner, Mrs. Johnson, a lifelong resident, stood talking to a small group of neighbors. Her voice trembled with both sorrow and determination as she said, "I've lived my whole life watching injustice pass us by. Today, Benjamin showed us that we can no longer be silent. A young man beside her nodded, his eyes shining with the promise of change. It's as if his words have lit a fire inside me, he said softly. I want to believe that our voices, our stories matter. Their words, filled with raw emotion, underscored the truth that change was beginning to stir. Across town, Benjamin was released from custody, not with a parade, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had transformed his deepest pain into a rallying cry. His face, marked by years of silent endurance, now held a new light, a spark of defiant hope. As he stepped onto the familiar sidewalk, he was met by a small gathering of community members. A local activist, Malik, stepped forward and said, "Benjamin, your courage today has changed everything. We see your pain and we see your strength. You've shown us what it means to stand up." Benjamin's voice, calm but resolute, replied, "I did it not just for myself, but for every one of us who has been overlooked, silenced, and hurt by this system." Inside a modest community center later that evening, a meeting was in full swing. The room buzzed with the energy of shared resolve. Voices rose in unison as people recounted their own stories of struggle. An older gentleman, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke, recalled, "I remember a time when our voices were dismissed as mere whispers. Today I feel like we are becoming a roar." The room fell silent for a moment as every person present felt the weight and the promise of that statement. Then a young woman, eyes bright with hope, added, "We must keep this momentum going. We must let every injustice be met with our united defiance." As the meeting continued, Benjamin listened quietly. Each story reminded him of the long history of hardship and resilience woven into the fabric of their community. His thoughts drifted back to the hours spent in that cold, confining police car, to the heavy silence that was finally broken by a single, courageous call. That call had become the turning point, transforming not only his life, but also the spirit of everyone who had long suffered under the weight of systemic prejudice. Later, as the meeting dispersed, Benjamin found himself alone with Malik in a quiet corner of the center. "I never imagined that one call could do so much," Benjamin confessed, his voice low and reflective. Malik placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It wasn't just the call, Benjamin. It was the courage behind it. You made a stand, and that stand has echoed through every heart in our community." Benjamin's eyes grew moist as he replied, "I've carried this burden for so long. Today I feel like I'm finally able to release some of that weight and let our voices rise together." Outside, the night had deepened, and the cool air brought a sense of renewal. Groups of neighbors gathered in small clusters along the sidewalks, sharing quiet words of encouragement. One man, leaning against a weathered wall, said to his friend, "Today, something changed. I saw it in his eyes, the determination to fight back against a system that has tried to break us." His friend responded, "We have been downtrodden for too long. Tonight, I believe that our future is brighter than our past." Benjamin's transformation was not just personal, it rippled outward, challenging the oppressive structures that had defined their lives for generations. In quiet homes and busy street corners alike, the community began to imagine a new world, one where every act of injustice would be met with voices raised in unison, where resilience replaced resignation. People began discussing reforms, planning peaceful demonstrations, and sharing their stories in the hope that these collective experiences might spur long overdue change. One evening, as Benjamin walked slowly through the neighborhood, he was greeted by familiar faces whose eyes reflected both gratitude and cautious optimism. A young mother stopped him on the sidewalk and said, "Your bravery today gave me hope. My son deserves a future free from the shadows of hate." Benjamin smiled gently and replied, "Every one of us deserves that future. It starts with us, speaking up and standing together." Her words, simple yet powerful, resonated deeply within him, reaffirming that his struggle was a part of a much larger movement, a movement that aimed to heal wounds inflicted over generations. In quiet moments of reflection, Benjamin recalled the long list of names of those who had suffered quietly before him, the friends, family, and strangers whose silent courage had paved the way for his own act of defiance. Their memory became a beacon, urging him to continue fighting even when the road ahead was uncertain. We are not defined by the scars of our past, he told himself, but by the strength we find in rising after every fall. His inner monologue was a testament to the enduring human spirit, a spirit that could transform pain into progress and sorrow into strength. The community's response continued to build, small actions coalescing into a broader movement that challenged the very foundations of systemic injustice. Local leaders, emboldened by the visible change in the hearts of their people, began organizing public forums and peaceful protests. In one such gathering, a spirited debate broke out among neighbors discussing the steps needed to ensure that the abuses of the past were not repeated. "We must hold them accountable," one neighbor declared, "and demand that our voices be heard in every corner of our society." Another added, "This is our time. We cannot let fear silence us anymore." Benjamin watched these exchanges with a quiet pride. Every conversation, every determined look, and every shared memory of hardship contributed to a collective understanding that change was not only possible, it was imminent. The oppressive barriers that had once seemed insurmountable began to show signs of cracking under the pressure of unity and shared purpose. Slowly, a sense of empowerment replaced the long-held resignation. Late that night, as Benjamin returned home, he paused outside his modest doorstep. The street was quiet now, yet the echoes of the day's events lingered in the cool air. In that moment of solitude, he whispered softly, "Tonight our silence is over. Tomorrow our voices will rise again." His words, carried into the stillness of the night, were a promise not only to himself but to every soul that had long endured injustice. Inside, as he sat in his worn but comfortable chair, Benjamin opened an old, faded journal, a testament to years of both pain and perseverance. He began to write, the pen moving steadily as if guided by the collective hopes of his community. With each word, he poured out the legacy of his struggles, the lessons learned, and the dreams for a future free from the chains of prejudice. His writing was both a cathartic release and a call to continue the fight, a reminder that every act of courage contributed to a legacy of resilience. In the quiet that followed his writing, the weight of the day's events slowly lifted, replaced by a growing certainty that the journey toward justice was just beginning. The legacy of his bravery would live on, not only in the hearts of those who knew him but in every whisper of hope that stirred in the corners of a once oppressed community. And as the first light of dawn crept through his window, Benjamin felt a renewed strength of promise that, despite the long road ahead, each new day carried the potential for change. His journey had transformed him from a silent sufferer into a symbol of defiant courage. In his newfound resolve, he understood that the fight for justice was never truly over, but that each voice raised in unity was a step toward a more equitable future. The call he had made had become a beacon, a spark that would ignite the flames of change in every corner of their community. And as he closed his journal, Benjamin knew that the legacy of resilience and hope would continue to inspire generations to come.